One thing that seems to be inescapable in life is death. It is the end that awaits all of us, a certainty that seems impossible to avoid. However, it is always truly unavoidable, or are there ways to cheat this impending doom? Throughout the centuries, there have been many tales of people who have seemingly managed to do just that, dodging the cold embrace of death through weird science, dark magic, or outright miracles. People have been trying to intentionally beat death and revive the deceased for a very long time. Serious efforts to clinically confront and defy death date back to at least the 18th century. In the 1700s, a Catholic priest and professor of natural history at Pavia University by the name of Lazzaro Spallanzani became obsessed with the idea of reanimating dead tissue after noticing that some seemingly dead microscopic life seemed to spring back to life after adding water to them. Spallanzani became convinced that it was possible to resurrect dead organisms, and he turned to the famous French skeptic and atheist Voltaire for guidance on this discovery. Voltaire believed Spallanzani's claims, and when asked what his opinion was on where souls went after death, he is said to have replied that it was up to Spallanzani to find that out for himself. Taking this as an encouragement to proceed, Spallanzani moved on with his experiments. He graduated to more complex life forms, notably cutting the heads off of snails to see if they'd grow back. Although he never did find the secret to resurrecting the dead that he had so hoped to find, his research led him to be the first to discover chemicals in the body that aided in digestion, as well as to observe white blood cells. In 1794, the Royal Humane Society of London carried out a series of experiments to restore life to those deemed apparently dead, arguing that in some cases corpses were not really dead, but rather in some sort of state of suspended animation from which they could be revived and brought back to the land of the living. These efforts were in response to the widespread fear of premature burial at the time, which was rampant and seen as proof that the soul could hang someplace between life and death and be revived. The Royal Humane Society sought to not only establish methods for reanimating such corpses, but also spread awareness and share their knowledge of such procedures all over the world. To be sure, their methods were crude. Most often the main techniques were to use electricity, massage, and the rather odd use of liquor forced down the throat, as well as tobacco smoke siphoned up the rectum of all places. As dubious as these methods may seem to us now, news of such experiments reached far and wide, with the city of Charleston, South Carolina, particularly embracing the theory. The Medical Society of South Carolina purchased equipment from the Royal Humane Society in 1793 and went about trying to raise public awareness of the possibility of resurrecting such apparently dead cadavers. Their efforts were so convincing that eventually a law was passed on August 19, 1793, that required all owners of places where alcohol was sold, as spirits were a key ingredient to the process, to take in persons deemed apparently dead and attempt to use the Society's techniques to bring them back to life. The law also mandated that all such establishments were to post a complete list of printed directions on how to do so. As time went on and the 19th century dawned, a great deal of stock was put into electricity as a means to reawaken the dead. This was an age when electricity and its effects were still little understood, and it seemed like the influence of electrical currents was almost magical in nature. Many experiments were done to measure the effects of electric currents running through all manner of things such as plants, animals, and even human beings, just to see what would happen. It was even supposed that electricity had the power to create life from nothing, a theory that would gain traction in 1837 when physicist Andrew Cross claimed he could form small organisms shaped like mites by simply running a current through an empty petri dish. It seems only natural then that the mysterious forces of electricity began to be seen as a possible route to the reanimation of the dead. In the 1800s, a physicist by the name of Giovanni Aldini carried out a series of twisted experiments involving the use of electricity to reanimate dead animals. The son of famous scientist and electricity pioneer Luigi Galvani, Aldini was an ardent believer in his father's theories on the application of electricity to bring the dead back to life. Aldini started out small, demonstrating how current could send dead frogs and other small animals into twitching spasms, but his experiments quickly began to devolve into more sadistic, morbid affairs. In one gruesome display, Aldini applied a Leyden jar which had been charged with a potent current to the decapitated head of an ox, which much to the horror of onlookers began to convulse and spasm, its tongue lolling about in its mouth, as if alive. Although this may seem like a natural outcome to us, At the time, it was seen as something magical on par with witchcraft, and it was thought that such movements were tantamount to the presence of life. It certainly seemed to be powerful evidence at the time that yes, indeed electricity could reanimate dead tissue. Aldini soon graduated from animals to humans as his experiments escalated in morbidity. Through no doubt nefarious means, he was somehow able to procure a steady flow of freshly executed criminals for use in his experiments. One of the earliest such efforts was when Aldini performed a demented procedure on a freshly killed 30-year-old man. An incision was made in the nape of the deceased man's neck, and a jolt was provided with a battery-powered prod. Aldini wrote of the experiment. The posterior half of the atlas vertebra was then removed by forceps when the spinal marrow was brought into view. A profuse flow of liquid blood gushed from the wound, inundating the floor. A considerable incision at the same time was made in the left hip through the great gluteal muscle, so as to bring the sciatic nerve into sight, and a small cut was made in the heel. The pointed rod with one end connected to the battery was now placed in contact with the spinal marrow, while the other rod was placed in contact with the sciatic nerve. Every muscle of the body was immediately agitated with convulsive movements resembling violent shuddering from the cold. On moving the second rod from the hip to the heel, the knee being previously bent, the leg was thrown out with such force the assistants, who in vain attempted to prevent its extension. Creepy to be sure, but at the time seen as a very promising result. Yet, Aldini was not satisfied, and would go on to take his experiments to even loftier heights of depravity. So convinced was he that electricity was the key to restoring life after death, that Aldini sought to prove that even a body was not necessary for his theory to work. He took the horror factor up a notch and started applying current to just the freshly decapitated heads of criminals by wetting their ears with brine solution and then stuffing electrified wires into their ears. This had the predictable effect of causing the disembodied heads to grimace, convulse, and twitch wildly. Aldinin was particularly fascinated by the movements of the eyelids during the procedures. Once writing, the action of the eyelids was exceedingly striking, though less sensible in the human head than in that of an ox. Such gruesome experiments gained widespread notoriety as Aldini brought his experiments on the road in order for all to see the wonders he was able to produce. In 1803, he infamously put on a public display in which he created lifelike movements upon applying current to a newly deceased man named George Forster, fresh from the gallows for killing his wife and child. The demonstration was done on a stage in front of an audience of shocked, gasping onlookers, and Aldini finally got the recognition he was after when the Royal College of Surgeons took notice and ended up awarding him their prestigious Copley Medal for his work. In addition to trying to bring back the dead, Aldini also claimed that he could use electricity to resuscitate nearly dead people such as those who have nearly drowned, and his work was some of the earliest evidence to pave the way for the use of electricity for resuscitation.